After 30 years of marriage, my wife betrayed me with my best friend. She stole half of everything and laughed in my face, saying I never deserved her. I stayed silent, but I had a secret weapon, months of recordings, and when the judge heard them, everything changed forever. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. My name is Graham Wilson, and for 30 years I believed I was living the kind of life every man wanted. I married Clara, the woman I thought was my soulmate, and together we built a home out of nothing. In the early days, we shared a small rented apartment with squeaky floors and mismatched furniture. I worked long hours at the factory, sometimes late into the night, while Clara managed our little place and dreamed of something bigger. We saved every dollar, celebrated small victories, and promised each other that one day all the struggle would be worth it. Over time, we bought our first real house, the kind with a front porch where Clara liked to sit in the evenings, and we raised our children within those walls. Through it all, my best friend Mark Turner was right by my side. Mark was more like a brother than a friend. He was the one I leaned on when bills piled up, when my father passed, when Clara had health scares. He spent holidays with us, sat at our dinner table, and laughed with my kids like they were his own. I trusted both Clara and Mark with my life, and for years I never questioned their loyalty. Looking back now, I realize that was my greatest mistake. Life moved forward in a rhythm that felt safe. I woke up early each morning, packed my lunch, and drove to the factory while Clara managed the house. On weekends, Mark would stop by, sometimes with a six-pack of beer, sometimes just to lend a hand fixing something around the yard. Clara would bring out lemonade, and the three of us would sit on the porch talking about old times. To anyone looking from the outside, we seemed like a picture of stability and loyalty. Clara and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary last year. I bought her a gold necklace, saved for months, and she smiled when I fastened it around her neck. Mark was there too, raising a toast, his arm around my shoulder like always. That night I went to bed proud of the life I had built. But in the weeks that followed, I began noticing little cracks that I could not ignore. Clara stayed out later than usual, claiming she was visiting friends. She laughed at jokes on her phone, then turned the screen away when I walked into the room. Mark started canceling our fishing trips, making excuses I'd never heard before. I pushed the doubts away at first, telling myself I was being paranoid, but something in my gut whispered that my safe, steady life was about to collapse. The first real sign came one quiet evening when I came home earlier than usual. Clara wasn't expecting me, and I heard her in the kitchen, speaking on the phone in a voice I hadn't heard in years. It was soft, playful, almost like a teenager again. I stood in the hallway, frozen, until I caught the words, "Don't worry, he'll never find out." My stomach dropped. She hung up quickly when she noticed me, forcing a smile and asking if I wanted dinner. I nodded, but inside doubt gnawed at me. A few days later, I drove past a diner on my way back from work and saw Clara's car parked out front. Through the window, I spotted her sitting in a booth across from Mark. They weren't talking like old friends. They were leaning close, whispering, laughing, their hands brushing on the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My best friend and my wife. I didn't walk in. I didn't confront them. I drove home, sat alone in my living room and stared at the walls we had built together. The betrayal burned through me, but I said nothing. That was the night I decided I wouldn't shout or fight. Instead, I would wait, watch, and prepare. From that night on, I could no longer ignore the truth. Every little detail screamed at me. Clara began dressing up more often, fixing her hair, even when she claimed she was just running errands. She guarded her phone like it was gold, carrying it from room to room, setting it face down on the table, even taking it into the bathroom. Mark became harder to reach, his once steady presence replaced with excuses, late meetings, car trouble, headaches. I had known this man since we were boys. I could tell when he was lying, and now every word that came out of his mouth tasted false. I wanted to rage. I wanted to confront them both and demand answers. but I knew what would happen if I exploded too soon. They would deny everything, twist it around, maybe even paint me as paranoid or controlling. Clara had always been sharp with her words, and Mark could charm his way out of a locked cell. No, if I wanted the truth to matter, I needed proof. So I started quietly preparing. I went out one Saturday and bought a small digital recorder from a shop across town where no one knew me. It fit neatly in my jacket pocket and could run for hours without needing a charge. That night, while Clara was in the shower, I slipped it under the cushion of the armchair she always sat in during her late-night phone calls. The first time I listened back, my heart pounded in my chest. Her voice was low but clear, and there was no mistaking it. She was speaking to Mark. She told him she was tired of pretending around me, tired of waiting for the divorce to go through. And she laughed about how blind I was. Mark's voice came through next, telling her to stay patient, reminding her that once she got half of everything, they'd be free to start fresh together. I sat in the dark, holding that recorder in my hand, listening to the two people I trusted most, plotting my humiliation like it was a game. Every word cut deeper than a knife, but instead of breaking me, it steeled me. I realized I had something far more powerful than anger. I had their voices, their secrets, and their greed captured in my pocket. That was the night I promised myself I wouldn't just survive this betrayal, I would use it. And when the time came, I would make sure both of them faced consequences they never saw coming. The days that followed turned into a performance, and I played my role with care. I acted like nothing was wrong, like I was still the blind, trusting husband who believed in every excuse Clara fed me. She would kiss me on the cheek before leaving the house, and I would smile back, even though I knew exactly where she was going. When Mark stopped by, pretending to check on me or borrow a tool, I shook his hand like nothing had changed, even though my blood boiled each time his eyes met mine. It was torture, but I understood that patience was my weapon now. Each night, after Clara went to bed, I sat quietly in the living room, listening to the recordings. Some nights it was just whispers about when they could meet again. Other nights, their conversations were uglier. Clara mocked me, saying I was too simple to ever realize what was happening. Mark bragged about how easy it would be to help her in court if she decided to file for divorce. They spoke of money like it was already theirs, discussing what they'd do with my retirement savings, how Clara would take the house, and how they'd finally live the life they'd deserved. I saved every file, labeling each one with dates and times. I kept backups on 2 separate flash drives, one hidden in the shed behind the lawnmower, the other tucked inside an old box of Christmas decorations in the attic. I even printed transcripts late at night at the library across town, so there would be no trace on my home printer. Piece by piece, I was building a wall of evidence, solid and undeniable. But with each recording I collected, the weight inside me grew heavier. It wasn't just the betrayal of a wife and a friend. It was the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, that they were treating like nothing. I remembered the nights I worked double shifts so Clara could stay home with the kids. I remembered loaning Mark money when he was broke, never asking for it back because he was my friend. And here they were, laughing about me like I was nothing more than a fool. One evening I nearly broke. Clara came home late, perfume clinging to her clothes, her lipstick smudged. She looked at me with that smug smile and muttered something about traffic. I almost slammed my fist on the table and shouted that I knew everything. But then I remembered the recordings waiting upstairs, the careful plan I had set in motion. Losing my temper would only give them control, so instead I swallowed my anger, smiled faintly, and asked if she was hungry. She shook her head and walked upstairs, her heels clicking against the steps like hammer blows. That night, as I sat with my recorder in hand, I realized something important. This wasn't about saving my marriage or even punishing them for cheating. This was about reclaiming my dignity. They thought I was weak, a man to be discarded after 30 years of loyalty. But soon, in a place where lies no longer worked, they would see just how wrong they were. The tension in the house grew thicker with every passing week. Clara had stopped pretending altogether. She came and went as she pleased, her phone buzzing at all hours. And she no longer bothered to hide the coldness in her voice when she spoke to me. It was as if she had already erased the 30 years we shared, leaving me like an unwanted shadow in my own home. Mark, on the other hand, grew bolder. He showed up less frequently, but when he did, he carried himself like a man who already owned half my life. I could see it in the way he leaned back in my chair, the way he laughed at Clara's jokes while glancing at me like I was the punchline. Then, one Sunday morning, the mask came off completely. Clara sat across from me at the kitchen table, her arms crossed, her eyes colder than I had ever seen them. Without hesitation, she told me she was filing for divorce. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't even soften her tone. She simply slid a stack of papers across the table and said she wanted half of everything. Half the savings, half the house, half the retirement I had worked myself to the bone to build. And then, as if cutting into me wasn't enough, she smirked and said the words that burned themselves into my memory. "You never deserved me anyway." I sat there in silence, nodding as though I agreed. My chest burned, but my face stayed calm. Inside, I was boiling, but I knew better than to let her see it. She thought she had broken me, that I was too weak to fight back. She pushed the papers closer and told me I could save myself some trouble by signing quickly. I looked down at them, then looked back at her, and I simply said, "If that's what you want." That night, when she was asleep, I pulled out the box where I kept the flash drives and transcripts. My hands shook, not from fear but from the steady fire building inside me. I read through the lines I had typed. Clara and Mark laughing about taking me for everything, planning their new life while tearing mine apart, mocking me as if 30 years of sacrifice meant nothing. Each word fueled me. I realized I had been preparing for this exact moment. She wanted to drag me into court and humiliate me in front of everyone. Fine, let her. Because when those recordings played, it wouldn't be my shame on display, it would be hers. In the weeks that followed, I played the fool. I let her believe I was giving up. She bragged openly about the life she was about to start with Mark, even taunting me that soon I would be alone, broke, and forgotten. Mark puffed up his chest, assuring her that once the judge heard her side, I'd be left with scraps. Every insult, every smug word, I tucked away inside me like ammunition, because I knew the day was coming when I would load all of it into the one place where truth couldn't be twisted, a courtroom. The more I pretended to be defeated, the more careless they became. Clara left her phone calls on speaker while she cooked, never realizing the recorder on the shelf above the fridge was catching every word. Mark boasted about how easy it would be to convince the judge that I was unstable, unworthy of handling my own money. They were planning not just to take half, but everything they could squeeze from me. The betrayal that once crushed me was now the very fuel I needed. And then the day arrived, a letter in the mail. The court date was set. Clara walked through the house humming that evening, like a woman already tasting her victory. Mark sent me a text, pretending to check in on me, as if we were still friends. I deleted it without a word. They thought the end was near. They were right, but it wasn't my end. The morning of the first court hearing, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt like a home. The photographs on the walls, the furniture we had picked out together, even the smell of Clara's perfume lingering in the hallway. They all seemed like props in a play that was finally coming to its last act. I dressed carefully in the only suit I owned, the same one I had worn for our daughter's graduation, the same one I had worn at funerals of people I loved. I wanted to walk into that courtroom looking steady, not broken. Clara wanted a man beaten down. I was going to give her the opposite. When we arrived, she walked through the courthouse doors with her head high, wearing a bright red dress as though she were walking a runway instead of filing for divorce. Mark trailed behind her in a new suit I had no doubt she bought for him. He didn't even look ashamed. In fact, he looked proud, like he was about to collect a prize. They didn't see me at first, but when they did, Clara gave a small smirk, and Mark nodded as if I were some stranger they had already forgotten. That look alone nearly made me lose my calm, but I clenched my jaw and kept walking. Inside the courtroom, Clara's lawyer wasted no time. He painted me as a tired old man who had been holding Clara back, a husband who failed to provide enough emotional support, and a man who, according to their claims, couldn't handle his finances responsibly. Clara nodded along, pretending to wipe away a tear while Mark sat in the back row with his arms crossed, watching with smug satisfaction. Every lie they told felt like a knife twisting deeper, but I sat still, hands folded, as though I had accepted my fate. When it was my lawyer's turn, he didn't start with speeches. He didn't argue about my loyalty, my years of sacrifice, or the money I had earned. He simply stood, cleared his throat, and said, "Your Honor, before we continue, my client has evidence that must be heard." Clara's head snapped toward me, confusion flashing in her eyes. Mark shifted in his seat, his confident smirk faltering just a little. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked what kind of evidence. My lawyer lifted a small recorder and a folder thick with transcripts. He explained that over the last several months I had recorded conversations between Clara and Mark, conversations that not only proved adultery, but also revealed their intent to manipulate the court and take everything from me. Clara shot to her feet, shouting that it was a lie, that I was making it up, but the judge silenced her with a wave of his hand. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice sharp. "We'll listen." The first recording played. Clara's voice filled the room, clear as day. "Don't worry, once the divorce is final, I'll get half of everything. He's too blind to see it coming." Mark's voice followed, laughing. "And if we push hard enough, maybe even more than half, he'll be left with nothing, just the way he deserves." The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of their betrayal echoing from the speakers. The judge leaned forward, his expression darkening. Clara's lawyer stammered, trying to object, but the judge waved him off again. More clips followed. Clara mocking me as weak, Mark boasting about tricking me, both of them planning their life together using the pieces of mine. Each word was like fire in the courtroom, burning away their carefully built lies. I didn't look at Clara as the tapes played, though I could hear her chair creaking as she shifted uncomfortably, her breathing turning sharp and shallow. Mark's face drained of color, his once proud expression collapsing into something much closer to panic. The judge sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw the shift. The power was no longer in Clara's hands. It was in mine. When the last recording ended, the courtroom was so silent you could have heard the ticking of the clock on the wall. The judge leaned forward, his hands folded, his face stern and unreadable. For a long moment he didn't speak. He just looked at Clara and then at me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. Clara, however, was unraveling. She shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between the judge and her lawyer, her hands wringing together like she was trying to squeeze the truth back into silence. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. His voice was steady, but the weight in his tone carried through the room. "Mrs. Wilson, I have presided over many divorce cases, but rarely have I heard such clear and deliberate scheming to defraud not only your husband, but this court." Clara's mouth fell open, her face flushing red. She started to protest, but the judge held up a hand. "Enough. These recordings speak for themselves. They reveal intent, infidelity, and malicious planning. Do you deny this as your voice?" Clara's lawyer stammered something about privacy, about recordings being unfair, but the judge cut him short. "Don't waste my time. The evidence is clear. Your client admitted, in her own words, to using this court as a weapon for personal gain. That will not be tolerated here." The air in the room shifted. The smirk on Mark's face was gone now. He sat rigid in the back row, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. Clara looked over her shoulder at him, as if begging him to say something, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. For the first time, I saw fear in both of them. The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Here's what's going to happen," he said firmly. "This court will not reward manipulation. Mrs. Wilson, Your demand for half of everything is denied. Given the evidence, you will receive only what is fair under the law, and that does not include alimony. Mr. Wilson will retain the family home and majority of the financial assets." Clara gasped as if someone had struck her. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but she shook her head, her eyes wide and wet with fury. She turned to me then, her lips trembling. "You set me up," she hissed, loud enough that the whole room could hear. I looked at her, not with anger, but with the calm she had mistaken for weakness all those months. "No," I said evenly. "You set yourself up. I just stopped pretending not to notice." The judge rapped his gavel, signaling the session was adjourned. Clara remained frozen in her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. Mark stood slowly from the bench, his eyes darting around the room like a man searching for an exit. For years he had walked with his chest high, acting like my brother, but in that moment he couldn't even look at me. He slipped out of the courtroom before Clara had the chance to catch him, leaving her alone to face the wreckage. As I gathered my papers and tucked the recorder back into my briefcase, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For months I had lived under the weight of betrayal, carrying the burden of their lies like stones on my back. But now, in this room filled with witnesses and law, the truth had spoken louder than either of them ever could. And the judge's face, the stern, disappointed glare he cast at Clara, was a memory I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. When we stepped out of the courtroom, Clara tried to keep her composure, but the mask was slipping fast. Her lawyer was whispering furiously, telling her there might be appeals, that maybe they could challenge the recordings, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on me, burning with a hatred that almost made her look like a stranger. 30 years of marriage, and in that moment, she was nothing more than a cornered liar. She rushed up to me in the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and hissed through clenched teeth, "You think you've won? You ruined me in there, Graham. After all I gave you, after all the years I wasted, you humiliated me like this?" Her voice cracked, but it wasn't sadness, it was rage at losing the game she thought she'd already won. People passing by slowed to stare. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "No, Clara. You ruined yourself. You just finally got caught." That only made her angrier. She lunged closer, jabbing her finger at my chest, whispering so only I could hear. "You'll regret this. Mark and I don't need your money to be happy. You'll die bitter and alone." But when I looked past her shoulder, I saw Mark standing by the exit, already halfway out the door. He hadn't waited for her. He hadn't even tried to defend her inside the courtroom. He was pulling his car keys from his pocket, his head down, his steps quick, as if the building itself might swallow him whole. Clara turned her head just in time to see him walking away. Her face crumpled, not with sorrow, but with shock. The kind of shock a person feels when the last piece of their plan slips out of reach. "Mark!" she shouted down the hall, her voice echoing against the walls. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking until the glass doors closed behind him. She spun back to me, her face pale now, the fury mixing with panic. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked truly lost. I walked past her without another word. My lawyer patted me on the shoulder, saying the judge's ruling would hold, that my assets were safe now. But I hardly heard him. All I could think about was how different everything looked in that moment. Clara had spent months mocking me, calling me blind, treating me like a fool. Mark had acted like he was clever enough to pull off a betrayal without consequence. And yet here they were, Clara standing abandoned in a courthouse hallway, Mark fleeing like a coward who realized his prize was gone before he could even taste it. Outside, the air felt different. The sky seemed brighter, the world lighter on my shoulders. Reporters weren't there, no cameras, just a handful of strangers watching as Clara stormed out minutes later, her lawyer trailing behind her, trying to calm her down. She didn't look at me again, not once. She climbed into her car, slammed the door, and sped off, leaving the parking lot with tires screeching like an animal retreating into the dark. I stood by my own car for a long moment, breathing deep, letting it all sink in. The betrayal had cost me nights of sleep, months of misery, and years of trust I could never get back. But it hadn't taken my dignity. It hadn't taken the life I built with my own 2 hands. And in the end, it hadn't given them what they wanted most: control over me. Engine. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see a broken man. I saw someone who had been tested, stripped of everything he thought was safe, and still stood tall. And I realized something then. The greatest revenge wasn't the evidence or even the judge's ruling. It was the sight of Clara and Mark watching their own scheme collapse while I walked away free. The weeks after the court ruling were strangely quiet, almost too quiet. For the first time in months, the house felt like it belonged to me again. I no longer had to listen for whispered phone calls or wonder where Clara had gone at night. I didn't see Mark's car pulling into my driveway anymore, and I didn't hear his laughter echoing in my kitchen. Yet beneath that silence, I knew it wasn't finished. People like Clara don't accept defeat easily. I was right. It started with small things: late-night phone calls that hung up as soon as I answered, anonymous letters stuffed into my mailbox, words scribbled in angry handwriting. "You'll pay for what you did." At first, I thought it was just Clara lashing out, unable to handle the humiliation of losing in court. But then one evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange. The garden gate was wide open. I always locked it. When I went inside, I found a photo frame smashed on the floor, the picture of our wedding day lying face down. Nothing else had been touched. A few days later, Clara showed up at the house uninvited. She didn't knock. She barged in like she still owned the place. Her hair was messy, her eyes red-rimmed, and her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with rage barely contained. She accused me of destroying her life, of turning everyone against her. She screamed that Mark had left her, that he had cut off contact the moment the judge's ruling was final. Apparently, he had packed up and moved out of town, not leaving a number, not leaving a trace. The man she thought would stand by her side had disappeared as soon as the money slipped out of reach. "Do you see what you've done to me, Graham?" she cried, pacing the living room like a storm trapped in a cage. "I gave you 30 years of my life, and you humiliated me in front of everyone. You think you've won, but you'll be miserable without me. You'll regret everything." I stood calm, watching her unravel. For so long I had wanted to shout, to hurl every insult she deserved. But in that moment, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt pity. Pity for a woman who traded loyalty for greed, who gave up 30 years of stability for a man who ran at the first sign of trouble. She thought she had outsmarted me, but in the end she had only exposed herself. When she saw I wasn't arguing back, her voice grew shrill. She tried to say she wanted to appeal the court ruling, that she'd find another lawyer who would tear me apart. Nothing left, no proof, no evidence, no ally willing to stand beside her. Even her own lawyer had dropped her case after the embarrassment in front of the judge. I told her to leave. My voice was steady, quiet, but it carried a weight she hadn't heard from me in years. She froze for a moment, stunned that I wasn't shaking, wasn't begging, wasn't afraid. Then she spat out bitter words, grabbed her purse, and stormed out. I watched her car speed away, the sound of the tires fading into the night. Later that evening, I sat in the living room and looked at the old wedding photo I had placed back in its frame. The glass was cracked now, a line running straight between her face and mine. I thought about tossing it out, but instead I left it on the shelf as a reminder, not of her, but of what I had survived. Clara wanted me broken. She wanted me alone and bitter. But the truth was I felt lighter than I had in years. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Mark was gone. Clara had nothing left to take, and for the first time in decades my life belonged to me again. I thought the storm had passed after that night Clara barged into my house and spewed her fury. For weeks afterward, life settled into a calm I hadn't known in years. I woke each morning to silence, brewed my coffee without fear of listening ears, and spent evenings in peace, reading by the lamp Clara once claimed was too old-fashioned. My life was finally mine. But as the saying goes, quiet seas don't last forever. Clara wasn't finished. People like her never accept defeat, not when their pride is bruised deeper than their pockets. It started with rumors. A neighbor mentioned one afternoon that Clara had been telling people around town I had abused her for years, that I controlled her money and locked her away like a prisoner. At first I laughed it off, knowing anyone who truly knew me would never believe such nonsense. But the more I went about my days, the more I noticed certain looks, the kind where people pretend to smile, but their eyes are heavy with doubt. A cashier at the grocery store handed me my change without a word. A woman at the post office pulled her child closer when I stepped into line behind her. Clara's lies were spreading, and though I knew the truth, the whispers stung. One afternoon I stopped by the diner downtown for lunch, a place Clara and I once frequented in better days. The moment I walked in, I felt eyes on me. A few people whispered, one woman outright scowled before turning back to her plate. When I asked the waitress, who had known me for years, what was going on, she leaned in close and sighed. "She's been telling anyone who will listen that you ruined her life, Graham. Says you tricked the judge, says you made fake recordings. Folks are starting to wonder if it's true." I clenched my teeth but stayed calm. Clara was desperate. She had lost in court, lost Mark, lost her reputation. Now she was trying to claw back any shred of power she could find. I told the waitress not to worry and left my lunch half finished. But inside, I knew I couldn't let this go unchecked. Silence had worked when I needed proof, but now silence could look like guilt. That evening, as I sat in my living room with the cracked wedding photo staring back at me, I realized the war wasn't about money anymore. Clara wasn't trying to take my assets. She wanted to take my dignity, my good name. That was the one thing she thought she could still destroy. I wouldn't let her. I gathered the box of transcripts, flash drives, and recordings I had so carefully prepared. The court had already seen them, but the public had not. If Clara wanted to make this a story for the town, then she was about to learn what a real story looked like. The next Sunday, our church held a community gathering. Nearly everyone from town came to those events, including Clara. She arrived in a black dress, her hair tied back, her expression perfectly arranged into that of a grieving, wronged woman. She floated from table to table, whispering to anyone who would listen. I watched from the corner, sipping my coffee, until I saw her lean in close to a group of younger women, clutching her hand dramatically to her chest. I didn't have to hear the words to know she was spinning another lie. I waited until the pastor called everyone together for announcements. The hall grew quiet, all eyes focused on the stage. My heart pounded as I stepped forward. People turned their heads, surprised to see me walking toward the front. Clara froze where she stood, her lips parting, her eyes narrowing into slits. She knew something was coming, but she had no idea how far I was willing to go. I cleared my throat and held up the folder in my hand. "I know many of you have heard things about me these last few weeks," I began, my voice steady though my hands trembled slightly. "I've heard the whispers, I've seen the looks, so let's stop whispering, let's hear the truth together." Clara shot forward, her heels clacking against the floor, her voice rising shrill. "Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you the same way he manipulated the court. He's a liar." The pastor held up his hand for silence, and the crowd quieted again. My lawyer had already given me permission to use the recordings publicly since they had been admitted in court. I pulled out a small speaker, pressed play, and let Clara's own voice fill the room. "Don't worry, once the divorce is final, I'll get half of everything. He's too blind to see it coming." Gasps rippled through the hall. A few heads turned toward Clara, whose face had gone ghostly pale. Then Mark's voice followed, clear and smug. And if we push hard enough, maybe even more than half, he'll be left with nothing, just the way he deserves. Clara lunged toward me, her hand outstretched as if she could snatch the sound from the air, but the pastor stepped between us. "Let him finish," he said firmly. I pressed play again. Another clip filled the silence. Clara's voice, cruel and mocking. 30 years and he still doesn't see it. He's pathetic. Once I'm gone, he'll be nothing. This time the gasps turned into murmurs. People whispered to each other, shaking their heads, some glaring openly at Clara. I didn't need to say anything more. I simply turned off the speaker, tucked it back into the folder, and looked at the crowd. That's the truth. Believe what you will. I stepped down from the front, my legs steady, my head high. Clara stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find words, but nothing came. Her carefully crafted story had shattered in seconds, undone by her own voice. The same women she had whispered to earlier now turned their backs, disgust plain on their faces. The pastor shook his head, his eyes filled with disappointment. By the time I reached the door, Clara had collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. For years, she had basked in admiration, pretending to be the perfect wife, the perfect woman. Now, in front of the entire community, the truth had scorched away her mask. She was left with nothing but the ashes of her own deceit. That night, as I sat alone in my quiet house, I thought about everything that had unfolded. 30 years of marriage had ended not with a gentle goodbye, but with betrayal sharp enough to cut through bone. My best friend had vanished. My wife had destroyed herself, and I was left standing amid the wreckage. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Clara wanted me broken, but in the end she broke herself. And as for me, I realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes revenge doesn't come from rage or punishment. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is just letting the truth speak for itself, and walking away with your head held high while those who betrayed you choke on their own lies. After that Sunday gathering, something shifted in the air around me. For months, I had lived under suspicion, carrying the burden of whispers that weren't mine to carry. But after those recordings echoed through the church hall, the looks I received began to change. The cashier at the grocery store smiled again when handing me my change. Neighbors who once hurried past me in the driveway now stopped to ask how I was doing. Even the men at the barber shop, who had sat in judgmental silence when Clara's stories first spread, now clapped me on the back and muttered things like, "Good on you, Graham. Took courage to handle it that way." I hadn't set out to win public sympathy. All I wanted was to protect the truth. But seeing the lie of myself. I wasn't just the man who had been cheated on. I was the man who had stood firm, who hadn't let betrayal erase his dignity. Clara, however, was spiraling. Word spread quickly that she had lost nearly everything in the divorce settlement. People who once invited her to luncheons or book clubs now avoided her calls. She had always thrived on attention, on being admired, but now the very people she sought approval from turned their backs. Her stories no longer carried weight. Her tears no longer earned pity. She became a ghost in the same circles where she once sparkled. I heard through neighbors and the inevitable gossip that runs through small towns that she tried tracking down Mark. But Mark had vanished. The man she gave up a 30-year marriage for had packed his bags and skipped town the moment her share of my assets slipped away. Some said he went to Arizona. Others claimed he'd run off with a younger woman in California. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that Clara had gambled everything and been left with nothing but her bitterness. Meanwhile, I began to rebuild, slowly and quietly. At first it felt strange. For so long, my life had revolved around her moods, her demands, her plans. Now, my time was my own. The house that once felt like a battlefield began to feel like a refuge. I repainted the kitchen, tearing down the old wallpaper Clara had chosen years ago. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, placing things the way I liked them rather than the way she insisted. For the first time, the house reflected me. The evenings were the hardest. 30 years of marriage leaves a mark, no matter how it ends. Some nights I sat in silence, staring at the cracked glass of our old wedding photo, remembering the young woman who once promised me forever. I wondered when she changed, or maybe if she had always been that way, and I had just refused to see it. The betrayal cut deep, but in those quiet hours I realized that I hadn't only lost Clara. I had lost a version of myself that always put her above everything else. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a loss, but a freedom. To keep my mind busy, I started working with my hands again. I had once been good at building things, small carpentry projects, furniture, shelves. Over the years, I let that part of myself fade under the grind of work and marriage. Now I found peace in the steady rhythm of sanding wood, hammering nails, watching something new take shape. A neighbor asked if I could build a custom table for her dining room. Word spread, and before long I was filling small orders for people around town. What started as a hobby turned into a side business. And with each project, I felt a piece of myself return. It wasn't just the money, it was the sense of creation, of proving that I could still build, still create beauty after so much destruction. Every plank of wood I touched reminded me that I wasn't defined by Clara's betrayal. I was defined by what I chose to do now. Still, Clara tried one last desperate move. She showed up again at my door late one night. Her hair unkempt, her eyes wild. She begged me to reconsider, to give her another chance. Not at marriage, but at support. She claimed she had nowhere to go, no one to lean on, that she was drowning. For a moment, I almost saw the woman I had married all those years ago. The young woman who had once smiled at me across a crowded room. But then I remembered the recordings, the laughter she shared with Mark while mocking me, the cold words in court. "Clara," I said firmly, "I gave you 30 years. You threw them away. I can't give you another 30 days. Her face hardened, her tears drying into rage again. She spat curses at me, screamed that I was cruel, and stormed off into the night. I didn't follow. I didn't feel guilt. The part of me that once would have rushed after her, desperate to fix everything, was gone. She had killed it long before. Weeks passed, and I heard less and less about her. People said she had moved to a small apartment on the edge of town, living off what little savings she had. Occasionally I caught sight of her at the grocery store, but she avoided my eyes, keeping her head down. The woman who once prided herself on her social standing was now reduced to a whisper, a cautionary tale. And me? I felt alive again. I went for walks in the park without the weight of suspicion on my shoulders. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with, because Clara never liked them. I spent weekends working on furniture orders, my garage filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. It was mine. One evening I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set. The house around me glowed warm in the fading light. For the first time in years I felt content. Not happy in the fleeting way Clara used to demand, but content in a steady, lasting way. Clara had wanted to break me. Instead, she freed me. Mark had thought he could outsmart me. Instead, he exposed himself as a coward. And I, after 30 years of sacrifice, betrayal, and pain, had finally learned the quiet strength of letting the truth carry me forward. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind the trees, I whispered to myself, "You're still standing, Graham. And that's more than they can say." The months that followed were steady, almost healing in their slowness. I had grown so used to living in chaos that the rhythm of quiet mornings and peaceful nights felt like an entirely new life. My small carpentry business was gaining traction. People in town admired the craftsmanship, and word spread faster than I could keep up with. For years I had worked in factories and offices, always under someone else's thumb. But now I was building not just furniture but pieces of myself that Clara had chipped away over 3 decades. But as I grew stronger, Clara seemed to unravel further. I didn't go looking for updates on her life, honestly. I wanted nothing more than to move on. But in a small town, news finds you whether you want it or not. A neighbor mentioned she had been spotted arguing with the landlord outside her new apartment, screaming about bills she couldn't pay. Another time, I overheard at the hardware store that she had tried to find work, but her reputation for drama and her constant need for attention scared employers away. She had built her life around being admired, around depending on others to provide for her, and now that she was on her own, she was floundering. At first, part of me wanted to feel pity. 30 years is a long time to share with someone, no matter how it ended. But then I remembered those recordings, her laughter with Mark, her sneering words about me being pathetic, her greedy promises to strip me of everything I worked for. The pity evaporated. Clara's downfall wasn't my doing. It was her own hand pulling her into the pit she had dug. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening in my own life. My work brought me into contact with people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old neighbors, former co-workers, even friends Clara had pushed away because she didn't like them. One of those reconnections was with Margaret, a woman I had known casually decades ago. She and her late husband had once lived down the street from us, and I remembered them as kind, simple people. After her husband passed, she had moved away for a while, but now she was back, renting a small house near the park. It started with her ordering a bookshelf from me. When I delivered it, we ended up talking on her porch for nearly an hour, about books, about how the town had changed, about how different life felt when you didn't have to live under anyone else's shadow. Her laugh was easy and her words were kind. There was no judgment in her eyes, no pity, no questions about Clara or Mark, just conversation, light and genuine. When I left that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a lightness in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with anger or revenge. Over the next few weeks, I found excuses to stop by, sometimes to drop off a small project, sometimes just to share a coffee on her porch. We didn't talk about the past much. She didn't pry, and I didn't feel the need to rehash the pain. Instead, we talked about simple things, the weather, the garden she was tending, the smell of fresh-cut wood that lingered on my clothes. It was the kind of companionship that didn't demand anything, and I realized how starved I had been for that kind of peace. Of course, word of this friendship spread, and it didn't take long before Clara heard. She showed up at my house again one evening, uninvited as always, her face twisted with a gad mixture of anger and desperation. "So, this is it," she spat, standing in my driveway with her arms crossed. 30 years together, and you move on with some widow like none of it ever mattered. I looked at her, calm as ever. "Clara, you moved on long before I did. Only difference is you chose betrayal. I chose peace." Her face contorted, her voice rising until neighbors peeked from their windows. "You think you're so noble, Graham? Everyone may pity you now, but they'll see. You'll end up alone, because no one can stand a man like you for long." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply turned and walked back inside, leaving her to rant in the driveway until she realized no one was listening anymore. Eventually, I heard her car door slam and the engine roared as she sped away. That was the last time she showed up at my house. As for Mark, I never heard from him again. Some said he was living in a rundown apartment 2 states over, working odd jobs to make ends meet. Others said he'd gotten into trouble with gambling and was keeping a low profile. Whatever the truth, I knew one thing. The man who once puffed out his chest and pretended to be my brother had vanished into obscurity. He had thrown away his reputation, his friendships, and even Clara, all for greed. His name was now just another whisper in town, and no one spoke it with respect. Meanwhile, life continued to blossom for me in quiet ways. Margaret and I never rushed into anything. We shared walks, dinners, long talks. I wasn't looking to replace Clara, nor was she looking to replace her late husband. What we found was companionship, the kind that feels like balm after years of being torn open. There was no betrayal, no scheming, no games. Just two people sitting side by side enjoying the simple gift of time. I realized then that rebuilding didn't always mean grand gestures or dramatic endings. Sometimes it was as simple as repainting a kitchen, crafting a table, or sharing coffee with someone who truly listened. My past was scarred, yes, but scars don't mean the end. They mean survival. As I sat one evening in the quiet of my workshop, sanding down the edge of a new project, I thought back to the man I had been a year ago, broken, humiliated, betrayed. And then I thought of the man I was now, steady, building, moving forward. Clara had tried to strip me of everything, but all she really did was hand me the chance to start fresh. And for the first time in my life, I was grateful to be alone in my own skin, free to decide what came next. As the months turned into a year, the sharpness of everything that had happened began to dull, though it never disappeared completely. The trail neighboring towns started reaching out after seeing my work in friends' homes. For the first time since I could remember, I was proud of something that was entirely mine, something not built under Clara's shadow. But while my life was slowly stitching itself back together, Clara's seemed to be unraveling faster than anyone expected. The woman who once thrived on admiration and gossip was now the subject of whispers herself. I heard from a former neighbor that she had been evicted from her apartment after missing too many rent payments. Another told me she had tried moving in with a distant cousin, only to be thrown out after a series of explosive arguments. She carried her bitterness everywhere she went, and bitterness is a weight no one else wants to share. The final straw for her came in public, the way most of her drama always seemed to. One evening, while I was at the grocery store picking up supplies, I heard shouting from the next aisle. When I turned the corner, I saw Clara standing there, wild-eyed, arguing with the store manager. She was accusing him of shortchanging her, waving a crumpled receipt in the air, her voice loud enough to draw a crowd. People who had once bowed to her charm now stood back, shaking their heads. She caught sight of me then, and her fury shifted like a storm finding a new target. "You!" she screamed, pointing at me with a trembling hand. "This is all your fault. You ruined me, Graham. You and your stupid recordings. You turned everyone against me. I should have taken everything when I had the chance." The entire store fell silent. Shoppers froze with baskets in their hands, eyes bouncing between us. The manager tried to calm her, but she shoved his hand away, stepping closer to me. Her face was red, streaked with tears, her voice cracking. 30 years, Graham. 30 years I gave you, and this is how you repay me. By leaving me with nothing." I didn't shout back. I didn't even raise my hand. I simply looked at her, steady and calm, the way I had in the courtroom. "You didn't leave with nothing, Clara," I said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You left with what you earned. That's the difference." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people turned away, embarrassed for her. Others stared with cold eyes, tired of her theatrics. For once, Clara seemed to realize she had lost her audience. Her shoulders slumped, her voice faltered, and she turned and stormed out of the store, the glass doors swinging hard behind her. That was the last time I saw her face to face. In the weeks after, rumors spread that she had left town entirely. Some said she moved in with a relative in another state. Others whispered she was drifting from place to place, surviving off whatever scraps she could gather. Wherever she went, she carried her reputation with her, and reputations have a way of following louder than footsteps. The same people she used to manipulate with her charm now avoided her entirely. For someone like Clara, who thrived on attention, that kind of isolation must have been worse than any court ruling. As for Mark, he never returned either. His name only surfaced when people spoke of cautionary tales. How greed can consume a man and leave him with nothing. His betrayal, once so sharp in my chest, had dulled into irrelevance. He wasn't my friend anymore. He wasn't even my enemy. He was just gone, like dust scattered by the wind. And me? I kept moving forward. My friendship with Margaret grew into something steady and comforting. We didn't rush it, didn't force it. We spent afternoons walking in the park, evenings sharing meals we both cooked, and mornings sometimes sitting quietly with coffee as the sun rose. After so many years of drama and manipulation, the quiet felt like a gift. It wasn't about replacing what I had lost. It was about discovering what I had never truly known: peace in companionship. One evening I sat on the porch with Margaret beside me, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. The air was cool, the sound of crickets beginning to rise. I thought of Clara then, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with finality. She had once been my world, but in her greed and betrayal, she had destroyed herself more than she had ever destroyed me. And as I sat there, my hand resting near Margaret's, I realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes justice doesn't come with grand punishments or dramatic finales. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of freedom, of peace, of a new chapter unshackled from the weight of the past. I raised my coffee mug slightly, as if toasting the fading sun, and whispered to myself, "Here's to surviving." For the first time in decades, those words didn't feel like resignation. They felt like triumph. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges, but it never erases them. Looking back, I still feel the sting of betrayal, but I no longer carry it like a wound. Instead, it has become a scar, a reminder of what I endured and what I overcame. Clara and Mark thought they could break me, strip me of my life's work, and leave me empty. But in the end, they only exposed their own weakness. Their choices led them into isolation and regret, while mine led me toward peace, freedom, and a new beginning. The house I once feared would be taken from me now feels alive again. My workshop is full, my hands busy, and my heart steady. The laughter that fills my evenings with Margaret is real, not the sharp, mocking kind that I once heard in secret recordings, but the kind that comes from honesty and warmth. I didn't just survive what happened, I rebuilt myself from it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: betrayal may knock you down, but it doesn't decide whether you stay there. It's living well when the people who tried to destroy you have faded into their own shadows. So, if you've listened to my story this far, I want to thank you. And I'll leave you with this: never underestimate your own strength, and never let anyone convince you that you are less than you are. In the end, the truth will always find its way to light. If you like this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready for another story of betrayal, survival, and justice, click on the next video waiting for you. Thank you for watching.